Last week, if you were joining online or if you watched throughout the week, we talked about something that could change your life forever. And part of that something is about how we grow as individuals, and when we choose to celebrate, both celebrate what God has done for us and celebrate the good things in our lives, which I think and I hope you've been practicing this week, it can truly make a difference in who we are and how things affect us. It can truly change our perspective on things. And this morning, as we're going to be together, or evening, or whenever you might be watching, because you can watch anytime online, and we're so glad you do. Today, what we're going to do is not talk about something that can change us, but how maybe something could change others. Something that could really impact other people's lives as it impacts ours. Because we're in this series called Disciple. And what a disciple is someone who follows and tries to grow and be like the one they follow. Jesus invited his followers to be his disciples. And not only that, he invited his followers to make disciples of other people all over the world. And you and I are part of that. We are disciples. Maybe some of us are early in our journey. Maybe we're just trying to figure out who God is and what we believe about Jesus. While others have been around for a little while longer, and you've got it pretty figured out, and you know what you're talking about. Well, both those categories and everything in between has something to do with what we're going to talk about today. But before we talk about it, I want to introduce you to three people. The first one here is Jeff. This is Jeff Loach. Jeff is a pastor in Nobleton, Ontario. Nobleton is just like a little bit north of Toronto, maybe about half an hour or so. He's a pastor at a Presbyterian church. Before that, he worked as a representative for the Canadian Bible Society in the eastern part of Canada. So I think Ontario and Quebec, I can't remember exactly. And I've known Jeff for a really long time. And someone else I want to introduce you to, and I think most of you know him, this is Jefferson Allen. Jefferson is a guy in our church. He has great hair, but he's also one of the most important people in his animation studio here in Ottawa. Jeff has worked and been part of this church for longer than I have. Anna and his kids, they're all here, and even Marvel the dog is around sometimes. And next I want to introduce you to Jefferson Fowler. Some of you might actually know Jefferson. He's visited a few times. But Jefferson works for City Kids in Hamilton. And before that, he was a youth pastor. And before that, well, he was a student. Now, these three people, Jeff, Jefferson, and Jefferson, all have some things in common. Yes, all their names are some derivative of Jeff. Yes, they're all three wonderfully good-looking men. But also, all three of them have played huge roles in my discipleship journey. Jeff has been a mentor of mine for years. In fact, I met Jeff at a random event when I worked for the Yonge Street Mission in Toronto. When I worked there, they sent me to a training on how to train and manage staff that you know, and Jeff happened to be there while he worked at Canadian Bible Society. I was sitting in the front right corner, and Jeff was sitting in the far back corner. And for some reason, I felt prompted to go talk to him. So I did. Little did I know that later, when I went through a very challenging situation in my life, he would be the one I would reach out to, and for a long time, we would meet every month and get together. Now we just do it once in a while, not as often. But Jeff has invested in my life for years. He's been a mentor to me. Now Jefferson, who you know, he hasn't necessarily been a mentor to me, but we've been like co-workers together. Jeff and I became friends pretty early on in my time here at Bromley, but we've also spent time getting to know each other on like a deeper level. We've had conversations on some deep things and what's going on in our lives, and we've also encouraged and challenged each other in what we believe and what we are to do about what we believe. And then Jefferson, I've been mentoring Jefferson for a few years. Some of you know him because he's visited, and you also know him because he actually applied a long time ago for a job here at Bromley and ended up turning it down. But Jefferson and I got to know each other because I knew his wife. And every now and then, Jefferson will call me up and we'll chat regularly and we'll deal with some of the stuff he's dealing with, and he asks my advice, and I've been mentoring him for years. All three of them have been an important role in my discipleship. And I would say that all three of them are what everyone should have in their discipleship journey. A connection with three different types of people. A Jeff, a Jefferson, and a Jefferson. Or in a biblical sense, a Paul, a Peter, and a Timothy. Here's what I mean by that. Some of you who are familiar with Scripture, you know some of the biblical characters. Peter, Paul, and Timothy are three important characters in the New Testament. Paul, he used to be called Saul, but had an encounter with the risen Jesus and stopped persecuting Christians and started planting churches. Paul's life radically changed with his encounter with Jesus, and he became an apostle, meaning one of the key leaders in the early church. Paul was actually mentored by a guy named Barnabas, who basically taught him how to live out his life, his new life of faith. And Paul, in turn, mentored others. Peter was a co-worker with Paul. Peter was someone who lived with Jesus. He lived those 3 years on earth with Jesus, and Jesus and him had an intimate connection. And eventually Peter himself would go out sharing the good news of Jesus with people around the world. And he and Paul were on the same team for the gospel of Jesus and sharing it around the world. They didn't always get along, and some of you who are familiar with the New Testament, you know in Galatians, Paul takes a sharp dig at Peter and some of the things he was doing. And rightfully so. But they were two co-workers who challenged each other and spurred each other on to be better. There's a proverb in the Old Testament that iron sharpens iron. They were like iron and iron together. And then Timothy was a young man who Paul identified as someone to invest in. So Paul mentored Timothy. Every single one of us has a Paul, a Peter, and a Timothy, even if we don't recognize them. And every single one of us, those connections both help someone grow in their discipleship and help us grow in our discipleship. Because ultimately, the value of our life will be who we invested in. And so for Paul, he invested it in his mutual relationship with Peter, but also with Timothy. For Jeff, he invested in me and many other people. For myself, I invest in people like Jefferson and others. Sometimes it's a mutual co-worker, like you're on the same level, you're maybe a similar life stage, and other times it's you're a little further ahead. And so you have more maybe wisdom or insight to offer someone. But in all those cases, in the Pauls, in the Peters, and the Timothys, they still help you grow in discipleship. And that's what I want to talk about today. It is relationships like this, connections like this, that help us grow to be disciples. And every one of us should have a Paul, a Peter, and a Timothy. Or in my case, a Jeff, a Jefferson, and a Jefferson. It's easy for me because they all basically are a derivative of Jeff, so I don't get them all confused. But do you have someone you are investing in? Do you have someone who's investing in you? Do you have someone in your life who walks alongside you and encourages you and challenges you and keeps you going? Well, those are the relationships I'm talking about. Those are the key connections that we try to foster here in church. And in fact, I think every church should. We try to help those who are younger connect with people who have a little bit more experience and who can invest in them. And so we need that because without it, we don't grow. We don't grow as the older, more experienced person, and we don't grow as the younger, less experienced person. To see how this works a little bit, we're going to look at some of Paul's writings that he wrote to Timothy. As I mentioned before, Timothy was a younger man who Paul invested in. Because Paul knew that the quality of his life wasn't so much about what he did, but about how much of himself he gave away and invested into others. He knew that just as Barnabas had mentored him and guided him and taught him, he needed to be investing in someone else. And so Paul writes these letters to Timothy. He's written two that we know of to Timothy. As Paul had journeyed with him, as Paul had brought him along on some of his missionary journeys, he eventually left Timothy to be a leader in some of those churches that they planted. And he encouraged him and challenged him in how he would lead them effectively. Most people believe he wrote it and he was soon to die. And so Paul writes this letter knowing that this will probably be the last thing he writes. So in 2 Timothy chapter 1, he writes this in verse 6. He says, "For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, or of me, his prisoner." Paul's writing to Timothy, and he's trying to encourage him. That's a big part of this kind of relationship. When you have someone who is your Timothy, you want to encourage them. When you see something in their life, you want to help bring it out and make it more of who they are. Paul saw in Timothy that he could be a leader in the church. What are you seeing in some people around you who may be younger, maybe on the journey in a different spot than you, and you see good things in? Who are you seeing, and what are you seeing? Are there words you could share with them that would help them to grow? Are there words that you could share of them from your own insight in your own life that could help them to grow? Well, Paul is writing, and he's saying, hey, I want to remind you, meaning he's already taught them, he's already had these conversations, but I want to remind you to fan into flame the gift of God. So the gifts that he has in his life, particularly the gift of the Holy Spirit, to keep nurturing that relationship, to keep encouraging him to be intimate with God. Because as someone who leads, that's really important. You cannot lead out of a place where you're not intimate with God. You will be very unhealthy. And so Paul knows this. Paul knows this because he's been leading for years. Paul knows this because people have tried to kill him because of his leading. Paul knows this because he's been in prison because of his leading. Paul knows this because even the people that he led and he loved rejected him because of his leading. So he encourages someone else saying, I've had this experience. I know you need to fan that flame. You need to keep going. You need to keep that intimacy with God. He says, for the Spirit of God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So God's given us what we need to be followers of him, he says. Paul is encouraging Timothy to a life of discipleship. That's what a mentoring relationship is. It's someone investing in someone else who's at a different spot in their journey, sharing their wisdom, their experience, and helping them along their path of discipleship. That's what Paul's doing to Timothy. Who are you doing that for? Who are you sharing your insight, your experience, and encouraging to stay close to Jesus? I believe every one of us should have a Timothy. Every one of us should have someone we are investing in. I got to tell you, it's something I've done for a long time, so it's very natural for me. I love mentoring people. I love investing in other people, and sometimes it's a long-term thing, like someone like Jefferson, or there's been a few other people in my life that I would say it's been over years that we regularly connect. And sometimes it's just for a time, a short time. Maybe it's even just for a conversation. Maybe it's just being available when someone needs someone else's advice. who are you willing to be available for? Because as much as it's about me giving myself to someone else and helping them grow, it also encourages me and helps me grow. That's the amazing thing about these kind of connections. And because this is one of the ways that we become disciples. We are connected to each other in these kind of relationships. They're never just one way. You are never going to be the smartest person in the room. You are never going to be the least smart person in the room, probably. We all have something to offer someone else. And even someone who's had a lot of experience and someone who's had little can learn a lot from someone who's had little. I know for myself, like when I talk to the young people here at Bromley, when I spend time with like Mitch or Mia or Sidoni or Angel or others, I'm always learning from them. They live in a world that is so very different than mine. And so I get to learn from them, and hopefully they get to learn from me also. Hopefully as I strive to invest in them as people of this church, they are investing in others, even if they don't realize it. Everyone should have a Timothy. And everyone should have a Paul. As you could be investing in someone else, who's investing in you? And everyone should have a Peter. Who are you walking with, journeying with, who encourages you, challenges you, and is a real friend? These connections, these relationships are what help us grow in discipleship. Paul talks a bit more in 2 Timothy. There's a lot of insight into the relationship that he had with Timothy. And he says this in chapter 2. He says, "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." Paul says, just as I invested in you, don't forget to invest in others. Paul says, be a Paul to somebody. In my case, be a Jeff to somebody. And that's why I have a Jefferson and others. Paul says, that's what we do. As we grow, as we learn, as we bound our knowledge together, maybe we've got this treasure in front of us, and we can open up that treasure chest and pull out some of that treasure and share it with other people who need to know. Who are you sharing your treasure with? Who are you investing in? Who are you walking beside? Who is investing in you? These relationships are how we grow. I've said it a few times already, because I want you to understand that. I want you to embrace them. Many of us, we get to this place in life where we feel like, you know what, I've arrived. You know, I've done this long enough. But there's always more to grow. There's always more to learn. And sometimes that learning comes when we choose to share what we have with others. And some of us, we might feel like, well, I've got nothing to offer. I can almost guarantee you, no matter what age you are, you have something to offer someone else. There's always someone who can learn from you. But I also want to offer a word of caution. When you choose to invest in someone else, you have to realize what a great privilege that is. And just as that's a great privilege, that's a great responsibility. You're going to help lead someone and help them grow. You can't do that if you aren't growing yourself. That's why we all need a Paul and a Peter. People to walk beside and people to invest in us. So that we too, like Paul says to Timothy, can share that with others. Who are you investing in? Who is investing in you? Who are you walking beside? I am so grateful for this physical church community of Bromley. I have developed some of the best friendships I've ever had in churches, and completely was surprised by it. I didn't expect it. And I've been so fortunate that I've got a few Peters in my life. Some of them are actually named Peter, and others are like named Jefferson or David or even Gord and others who I can walk alongside and I can grow alongside with. and I can learn from. And if you are someone who's, maybe in my age, maybe a little bit older, maybe even a little bit younger, I got to tell you, there are people here at Bromley to walk alongside you. There are people that you could have real good friendships with. Real relationships that aren't just superficial, but actually can challenge each other and help each other grow. But you have to be willing, and you have to be vulnerable. And you have to take that risk. But I can tell you that from my own relationships, those risks are worth it. They're hard sometimes, but they're worth it. And as well, we have many Pauls in our church. Yes, we have some people actually named Paul who have a lot of, wisdom even at a young age. But we have a lot of people who have journeyed in their life who can offer each of you some insight into your stages of life. We have many people who have, raised kids and helped those kids grow up, and those kids are great, or sometimes those kids aren't so great and they're struggling. But they have insights that could offer to people like me or other people who have young kids. We have many people who've gone through life events that are bigger than any of us could have imagined. Sometimes sicknesses, sometimes economic struggles, who have a lot of insight, who could help be Pauls to some of us Timothys. But we have to take that risk. We have to invest in others. And I got to tell you, all of us can be a Timothy to someone in this church. Whether you're joining online and maybe you don't even know some of us, you never even met us, but I can guarantee you there are people here who want to share God's goodness in your life and want to invest in you. And so together we can be those kind of connections we need to be with each other. We could be someone's Paul, we could be someone's Peter, and we could be someone's Timothy. Because we need all three of those to really grow in being a disciple. Those relational connections are key. So I want to ask you again, as you've spent a week investing in yourself, in celebrating, investing in the art of celebration so that you can have a perspective and a focus that's on Jesus and the difference Jesus makes in your life. As you've done that, and hopefully it's helped you grow and you've seen some changes in your week, I want to ask you, who is investing in you? Who is walking alongside you? And finally, who are you going to invest in? If you don't have someone in those categories, whether it's deep friendships to walk alongside you, or people to invest in you, or people to invest in, I want to encourage you this week to be praying for those relationships. You should be investing in someone. It might not be a formal thing, like where you meet for coffee once a month, or you don't meet for coffee now because we're not allowed to meet for coffee, but you talk about meeting for coffee and then talk on the phone. But it might just be that once in a while you're just available for people, or you share what you know with some people who could use that. Do you have anybody that's investing in you? Pray about that. There's an element where maybe you don't even know the people that are investing. Maybe you just read a lot of books, you listen to some podcasts, you watch some sermons like this, and so there's some level of distance, but they're investing in you. But who do you know that can invest in your life? Who can be your Paul? Pray about that. Who can be your friend and the Peter who can walk alongside you, and who can be your Timothy? Who can you invest in? We all have something to offer, and we all have something to learn. And to be a disciple is to be someone who is a learner, but also someone who is investing themselves in others. Because as I said before, the quality of our life really is dependent on what we give away, who we invest in. And so I want to encourage you this week to pray. Pray if you don't have a Peter, if you don't have a Paul, if you don't have a Timothy, I want you to pray and ask the Holy Spirit to help guide you in those relationships. And then take some bold steps, because God didn't give us a spirit of timidity, as Paul reminded Timothy. Take some bold steps and ask someone either to invest in you, or ask someone if they'd be interested in being mentored. Or challenge your friends and say, hey, do you want to have a deeper friendship where we actually talk about deep things and not just what we binge watch on Netflix? God invites us into these connections. He's made us for them. They can be virtual and they can be physical, but they're worth it no matter what. I want to encourage you on your journey of discipleship. Who is your Paul? Who is your Peter? Who is your Timothy? Take time to pray and see who they are and invest in those relationships. Because when you do, you will be amazed at how much you've grown in your journey of discipleship.